Welcome to the Rediscover You in Midlife Pod Summit, hosted by The Roller Coaster. My name is Lucy Q. 5 years ago, the emotional turmoil of midlife turned my life into a shitstorm. To make things worse, I had no idea that my chaotic emotions were due to the roller coaster of midlife. I thought I was crazy, and I felt completely alone. I've come to realize that midlife is more than a list of symptoms that we have to endure or cure. Midlife is the beginning of our next chapters. This is our time to be heard, to live our best lives, and to fix those pesky hormones. Join me as I chat with experts and industry leaders about nutrition, bone health, hormones, mindset, healing, journaling, living life to the fullest, and yes, even sex. I'm inviting you to throw your head back, arms in the air, and come along with me for the ride. I was finally able to start my journaling practice back in 2018, but that was only after several failed attempts. Before I was really able to connect with journaling, I had purchased countless blank journals with high hopes of pouring myself onto their pages. Instead of spilling my words of wisdom and insight, I'd find myself sitting there just staring at blank pages, painfully trying to find something to write. That is why I created Your Journaling Journey, a quick start guide to begin your journaling practice today. Your Journaling Journey is a guided journal with daily prompts, gratitude, and affirmations. You can get your copy of Your Journaling Journey today on Amazon or check out the show notes for links. Welcome back to the Rediscover You in Midlife Pod Summit. I'm your host, Lucy Q, and joining me is Rebecca Rothstein. Rebecca is an industry leader in Pilates, bone health and movement education, and the founder of Buff Bones, a medically endorsed exercise system for bone and joint health with online classes and trained instructors in more than 30 countries. Rebecca has presented at numerous conferences in the Pilates industry, at the International Osteoporosis Foundation Worldwide Conference, and the International Association for Advanced Medicine and Science. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks so much for having me, Lucy. I'm really happy to be here.
So I have to ask the first thing, and this comes to mind because I know I'm guilty of this, but are we paying enough attention to our bone health?
No.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go.
Bye-bye.
No, and that was, I have to say, I agree 100% because where in, our overall conversations about our health and wellness do we talk about our bones? It's not until, you break one that you even think about them.
Exactly. And I really want to bring much more of this conversation into midlife discussions, because when people hear that I specialize in osteoporosis, they automatically assume that I work with seniors and elderly. And sure, I do, but actually the beef of this is midlife, and especially midlife women. And there's this interesting not even correlation, but just association people have with osteoporosis of, oh, it doesn't really affect me, or no, I'm not going to worry about this till much later. And it's not something that I'm at risk for. And in reality, forget about even osteoporosis. When we're talking about bone health in general, we all start losing bone mass in our 30s. So, I mean, we're not even talking midlife. We're talking earlier than that. And another interesting aspect of this is I've had people say, oh, I don't have osteoporosis, but I did have a fracture. And how did you fracture? Well, I was walking and I tripped. Actually, that counts as a fragility fracture, meaning you've had a fracture from standing height or below, not falling off a ladder or a horse. And automatically, regardless of your bone density score, that classifies you as having osteoporosis. So there's a lot of clarification that needs to be in this sphere.
I've never even thought of it that way. I've always thought of myself as being very heavy bone structure. I'm a fairly thick person, let's call it. And I think that's maybe, and you're probably going to tell me it's a myth, because I'm probably thinking, oh, I'm never going to have to worry about that, where chances are I probably am.
It is a myth, although there is some truth to the myth. So people who have smaller bone structure, like myself, I'm only 5 feet tall and I'm pretty tiny, are at greater risk for osteoporosis than somebody with a larger bone or skeletal frame. But that doesn't mean that you are clear and free and should not be considering the health and safety of your bones. So I've worked with patients and clients that are of all sizes that have had bone loss, or I should say excessive bone loss, specifically then osteoporosis. And people don't also recognize that, because they think it's a disorder that only affects small bone people. They don't recognize that there's an association or a risk factor of osteoporosis with people with type 2 diabetes, in fact.
Oh, now I just realized we haven't actually defined what osteoporosis is.
Great point.
I don't even think I'm 100% clear now.
Yeah, it's a good question. So osteoporosis is a metabolic bone disorder, or it's actually characterized as a disease by the World Health Organization that involves both low bone mass or bone loss, as well as changes in the structure or architecture and integrity of the bone. And I mention this definition because it's fascinating. That definition, you notice, had two parts: that you've had bone loss and you have low bone mass, but also there's qualitative changes in the structure of the bone, in the architecture. And that second component has gotten very widely lost in recent decades. So just because somebody has low bone mass, by the diagnosis of osteoporosis that comes from a bone density scan, which only measures the bone mass, they may be determined to have osteoporosis because they have low bone mass. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to fracture. It technically is that changes in the architecture and the quality of the bone that would also make it susceptible to fracture. But our diagnostic tools that are most prevalent don't actually account for that. So it's a really interesting area because there's so much that is based on the density of your bones. And by the way, the other part of this that I should mention is it makes your bones susceptible to fracture. That's the real concern. But we have a lot of people out there that may or may not have low bone density that are fracturing. And that's really the big concern, regardless of the density of your bones. And you may have somebody that's tiny like myself that automatically is going to have less bone mass than somebody like yourself, who you're saying is a larger framed woman. So that technically predisposes me to having lower bone mass than you would. Does that mean that my bones are weaker, that I'm going to fracture more? Not necessarily. And that's where it gets into this kind of murky area.
Okay, so going back to those changes, that architectural changes, are those visible changes? Like if I look at my body, can I see that I've had these changes?
No, and I'm really glad you asked that. People are going to think that I planted this question, and I didn't.
No, I'm thoroughly confused, and I'm like, well, can I see if something's wonky and know, like, ooh, that's a clue?
That's one of the biggest challenges with osteoporosis, is that it is called a silent disease. And for good reason, because you do not visibly see and you do not feel the architectural changes that are happening within the bone structure. So if somebody says, and I've had this with clients and patients before, who will say, oh, I hurt so much, I know it's the osteoporosis. Say, well, osteoporosis doesn't give you any pain. A fracture could lead to pain, but osteoporosis itself is it's asymptomatic in that aspect. So if you're feeling pain aside from a fracture, it could be from anything, or it could even be osteoarthritis. the form of arthritis that is most commonly known to people, where there's a degeneration of cartilage within the joint and you have pain or stiffness, etc. But that is not osteoporosis. So you don't know. And that's part of the challenge, that you don't know that you're losing bone mass. And it's all the more reason why we have to be so proactive and put bone health at the forefront of our lives and of our health checklists.
Yeah, that's a bit scary because, I mean, ultimately, our bones is what holds us up.
Exactly.
So, I mean, if you don't have bones, I mean, and you see anyone with a broken ankle or whatnot, they're not moving. And if your body's not able to move the way it should, it just leads into so many other problems. So, what actually causes osteoporosis?
Well, there's a number of risk factors. So, for all of your listeners, if we're talking about midlife women, as women hit menopause, we can lose up to 20% of our bone mass. And within those first 5 to 7 years, which is pretty startling. So, menopause is an important factor because when we hit menopause, we have a pretty dramatic loss in estrogen levels. And estrogen is one of the key elements that preserves bone. It's the hormone that preserves bone. And so, as you lose estrogen, you not lose all, but you lose a good chunk of bone mass. And so, age alone can be a factor, but men are also at risk. It just happens that men lose much more bone mass later in life, so in their mid 70s, which also coincides with the time that they become at much greater risk of sarcopenia or the loss of muscle mass and power.
What's
And
sarcopenia?
sarcopenia.
What is that?
It's the loss of muscle
Okay.
mass and, or depending on the definition, power as well. So we start to have degeneration of muscle tissue essentially as we get older. And you're probably familiar with this as you see elderly people that might that maybe you've known somebody throughout their life and you might notice that they get really skinny as they
Oh,
get
you're
older.
talking.
Or
Oh, that's when it's
a little
just like
scrawnier.
their skin just looks like it's paper thin over bones type of thing. Like all
That's
the
there's
muscle
there's
is,
several different elements going on
yeah,
there, but yeah, it's just you notice that there's not as much muscle as there had been
yeah.
previously. And sarcopenia has a lot of dangerous components that go along with it for many things, including also a relationship with osteoporosis as well. So, age is one factor, but then, and this also has to do with changes in sex hormones. But other things that are secondary factors or can cause what's known as secondary osteoporosis can be things such as long-term use of glucocorticosteroids. Say you're somebody who has colitis, ulcerative colitis, or Crohn's disease, and you've been on high doses of prednisone for long periods of your life. That's an example of one risk factor. Thyroid disease, parathyroid disease, use of proton pump inhibitors has had a little bit of correlation on and off throughout the years. There are other aspects, people with, why am I blanking on the gluten sensitivity? Uh,
Celiac.
Thank you. Celiac. See, there's my
Oh,
midlife moment.
I was shocked. I remembered.
It's part of my work and I can't remember it. Celiac disease is another example because of malabsorption and absorption challenges. So there are a number of different risk factors and different things that could cause it. But other things can be a history of eating disorders. So, malnourishment, people who have not had much exercise throughout their life, smoking, very high alcohol intake. These are all things that are risk factors also that you can change. And that's why I'm mentioning these as well.
Okay, so for the women out there listening, they're feeling just like I am, going, crap. Is it like now I'm wondering, is it too late? Is there anything? I'm 49. I don't know if I'm going to have any problems. So what should I start doing?
a lot. But there are so many things that are manageable.
I got a pen and paper, Rebecca. Go for it.
So just starting with the last couple things that I mentioned, if you're a smoker, let's start working on removing that from your life.
Is that vaping too, or just tobacco?
It's generally just been tobacco.
Okay.
And I don't know about, in fact, that's an interesting question that hasn't come up that much, and that I will look into, about any research that is done looking at vaping. I would say that it's limited, whatever research there is, because it's more recent.
Yeah.
That we've had vaping as an option. But tobacco specifically is the issue. And then also just careful with alcohol intake. I'm not going to tell you not to have your glass of wine, but limiting it to several.
So a bottle a day is not a good idea.
Exactly. A bottle a day is probably not going to be ideal for you. And it's certainly not ideal for your bones. And then there's all sorts of nutritional elements that we can consider, from your calcium intake to your vitamin K, your vitamin D, your magnesium. There's elements and nutrients from boron and silicon, and we can go a bit on and on these aspects. But I also am a bit cautious about giving nutritional advice, because I'm not a licensed nutritionist. And specifically, without knowing what your medical condition is or anything in your medical history, I'm not going to start telling you to take vitamin K or having loads and loads of kale if you're on blood thinners, because that could actually kill you. So there's major contraindications there. I stick to my specialty of exercise, which is what I'm going to next tell you about. So several different things. One has to do with weight-bearing exercise. When we talk about weight bearing, it literally means bearing your body's weight against gravity. And people automatically assume that means you're standing. Yes, for your spine and for your hips. However, what you never hear about is that the third most common site of fracture for people with osteoporosis, and the most common early on, so say in our midlife demographic, is actually the wrist. So, people always worry about fractures of their hips. Yes, but most likely that's not going to be happening to you in midlife. That's something that happens much later in life when it happens. Right now is our time to be building up that hip strength to make sure that we don't fracture later, in our hips especially, or also in the spine. But I mentioned the wrist specifically because weight-bearing exercise for the wrist means being on your hands and knees, crawling around, doing your push-ups. Those are just two simple little examples of weight-bearing for the wrist. Weight-bearing for your spine and for your hips would be, like most people assume, in an upright standing manner. Another thing that is very important is resistance-based exercises. So anything that strengthens your muscle and gives you some kind of external force to load against. So for instance, pulling weights at the gym, pushing things away. So those external loads, which is what provides for the resistance training. But also you can think of resistance training even with your own body weight. So gravity itself, when you're doing something even like push-ups, you're getting all that gravitational force as you're pushing the ground away against your body weight, which is in a very inclined position, which makes even more gravitational load against your wrists than, say, if you were standing up and pushing yourself away from the wall. The third thing that's really important is impact exercises. So impact is the additional force that comes from gravity from, say, jumping. Like running is a high impact exercise. But we run into a conundrum because many of us may have arthritis and it might not feel good on our joints to do an exercise or activity such as running. Or we also, if you're at high risk with osteoporosis, high risk of fracture, then running might not be optimal for you. But we can still get an impact, a low impact, say by standing and lifting your heels and then dropping your heels. So going like this with your heels in a standing orientation. Those are known as heel drops. And that's another way that you can add impact into your bones that will help stimulate the what is known as osteogenesis, or formation component of the bone tissue.
So my next question is, well, how much, say for me, I've not paid attention to any of this, or I don't think I have. I mean, I do yoga, so I do, cat, cow, down dog, but I do find downward dog very challenging because I just don't find I have the strength in my upper body.
Yes.
So outside of that, I mean, how do we figure out what we should do to start, how much and for how long? Because I know a lot of people can make that mistake, and I know I've done this, is that you're like, okay, yeah, I have to focus on my bone health, and you do all this stuff, and then you bugger something up, and then you're out for 4 weeks.
Exactly. So I have two answers for that. Going back to even your downward dog position, there are always ways that you can modify things. And for one thing, I want to tell you that yoga or Pilates, these mind body type of exercises, also have great benefit. So, there's weight bearing elements to them that you can be implementing. B, there's resistance components as well. That said, you do want to add external loads in addition, but they are outstanding, especially because they also help you with your balance. They also help you with mobility. Both of them have a lot of fine tuning that occur, that what we call motor control, but they also both integrate breathing, and breathing is essential as just an element that is basic to any kind of body exercise that you do, because of respiration, because of the circulation and improvements of circulation, because of the work of your primary breathing muscle, your diaphragm, and how that relates directly to the areas of your spine that are most susceptible as well for fractures. So don't discount exercises or exercise forms like that. But if you wanted to even take an example like a downward dog, say it feels very strenuous on your wrists. All right, couple things. One, you could start by just being on your hands and knees and see what would happen if you could lift your knees and hover off the ground for 5 seconds and then lower back down. And then you can incrementally build up to a little bit more. But maybe the restriction is more in the length in the back of your thighs, like your hamstrings, that you don't feel you can actually straighten your knees to get that pike shape, that upside down shape that is required to perform a downward dog. You could do things against a wall where you have your hands against the wall and you slowly just walk your legs backward until you're at that nice 90-degree angle of your hips, so that you can work on that mobility component. But to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of just piecemeal things like this, which is why I created the Buff Bones method itself, which is a whole systemic method and a compilation of these different exercises, so we can really organize the body to lead up to these types of movements and exercises, or poses, if you will, that you want to perform and that are going to lead you throughout everything you want to do in your life. And ironically, we just launched last week a challenge, a 10-day challenge that walks you through all these starting elements for those weekend warriors, or for the folks that, like, you're talking about yourself, like, where do I even begin? Because it's really overwhelming. There are these different elements and skill sets that we need to work on and to achieve. Not perfect, but we're always working towards different goals. But how are you going to, add on especially heavier weights that are necessary for your bones, but are not appropriate starting out? What's your journey to get to that point? And then beyond that, how do you work on your balance so that you don't fall, whether it's now in midlife or later down throughout at other points in your life, because those falls are the largest cause of fractures.
So is Buff Bones like an online program that you can subscribe to, or is it a delivered course? What is it exactly?
It's a bunch of things. So it's several different elements. There is an instructor training program, which is one aspect of it. So you can find a live instructor anywhere around the world. We've trained hundreds of instructors since 2011. And then there's also online programming that you can look for. So for instance, I'm not sure if where you're located in Canada, in the corner of Canada where you are, I'm not sure if we have an instructor there, but that's why we also have online content and online programming, where we have also different types of classes, on-demand options for you, whether it's a 5-minute a day program we have, or classes that are of different lengths that you can subscribe to for a monthly subscription. But there's also an advocacy element, and this is part of what I also do along with teaching our instructors to do, which is to promote bone health to communities around the world that are at various risks for osteoporosis, as well as how to promote it in childhood and youth. So trying to help change the educational platform and discussion surrounding bone health. Because one of the things I didn't mention is that I was actually diagnosed with osteoporosis when I was 28. And that's the reason that I do what I do.
Say, that's very young.
It is very young.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I looked nothing like what the stereotype is of, the 78-year-old person with osteoporosis who is stooped over. And that's really not the reality. It can be the reality for some, but there are many, many people who have osteoporosis or osteopenia, which is the precursor to osteoporosis, and look nothing like that stereotype. And as I mentioned, I do happen to be a very small, thin woman, but also that's not necessarily the case for a number of people with osteoporosis as well. So trying to share the story through my story, but also through the story of the many clients and patients that I've worked with on what does osteoporosis look like and what we can do to prevent it, but more importantly, even what we can do to prevent fractures. Because even if you have osteoporosis, it doesn't mean that you're doomed to fracture. And that's what I totally thought when I first was diagnosed. And I was already a professional working in this field. And I already thought that, my life is over. And I think there's not enough attention that is paid to the fear and isolation that many people experience after a diagnosis.
And you have a special gift for our listeners too, don't you?
I do, yes. So for those who are listening today, we are offering a free short workout so that you can experience some of the things that I'm talking about. Why? Because I can talk to you about this all day long, but intellectually, to learn something is very, very different from the kinesthetic experience, meaning the embodiment, and for you to actually go through and perform these movements and experience the workout in the way that I'm referring to.
To get your workout, make sure you go to nectargrowth.com. That's nectargrowth.com. It is our private online community that is far away from all forms of social media. And by being part of this Pod Summit, you are going to get the first 30 days free. But I know you're going to want to hang around a lot longer because we have a lot of fun in there. It's full of all sorts of resources, and we are going to be hosting our monthly fireside chats. Now, this is where you can connect with women just like you, share in authentic conversations, and yes, when we need to, we are going to vent. So make sure you join us at nectargrowth.com. You can also find links in our show notes and your daily Pod Summit emails. And thank you for taking the time to listen. And Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being here, and I hope that some of this information has been helpful to the listeners.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Roller Coaster Podcast. Want to chat or share your ideas about today's show? Pop me an email at hello@therollercoasterpodcast.com. Don't forget to connect with me on Facebook and Instagram at The Roller Coaster Podcast. Our theme song, Roller Coaster, was performed by The Lucky Setback. Audio editing by the one and only Jeff Quigley of Quigley Creative.
Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby. I wanna ride, 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 ride. Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby. I wanna ride, 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 ride. Roller coaster.